Recording in progress.
Our group. We're just trying to think how many years we've been coming. How many times have you come up to 3 times a year? So.
Yeah.
10 years.
So I think I just left.
You weren't in robes.
No. So probably 2012 then, maybe, or 2011, 2012. Yeah. So time flies. Anyway, it's good to be back. We're still. The only difference is we're in this room rather than that room.
Correct, yes.
But the same building. It's always good to be back and to see familiar faces as well, and new faces too, as well. So tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own late teacher. She was known as Venerable Myokyo, and that was her ordination name during life. And as I explained previously, she had a posthumous name given, which was Daiyu Myokyo Zenji. Daiyu means great oak. The oak was chosen because it's the national tree, and obviously she spent her teaching life here. And also the association with trees is because trees are symbolic, particularly in Chinese and Japanese, for providing shelter. And rather like the Buddha's teachings also, they provide shelter for adherents of the people whose heart's inclined to follow the Buddha's way, the way out of suffering. And the reason that I'm giving this talk in this month of March is because on the 29th of March it is her death anniversary. She died in 2007, and which is a long time ago, nearly 20 years now. And I had the great good fortune not only to meet her, but to train with her. I started in the late 1980s, about 1987, 1988, something like that. I had the great good fortune to really train with her. She was a very rare opportunity to, be able to come into, that ambit. And she was quite a formidable figure as personality and character-wise as well. So I really wanted to, as I say, just tell a few stories about her own life and her training. And the reason is that she used to tell us these stories, but these stories were never nostalgic. They weren't about, I'm going to tell you about my upbringing. It always had some kind of training angle to it. So that's really what I want to do this evening, is just tell you a few of those stories that I remember. And the title of this talk, The Torrent from the Mountain Peak, was, after she died, I was still living at Shobuan, and I was asked to provide a sort of memorial article. And so I thought, well, the best I could really do, because she would have absolutely hated to have had a biography. She didn't even like a photograph being taken either, and she was very wary about personality cults around teachers and gurus and things like that. And she was very averse. In fact, I remember being with her once and somebody rushed up and said, "Can I take a photo?" And she went, "No." The person sort of looked, "Oh, what do we do now?" But she, as I say, she was very averse to any form of personality cult because she felt it took the spotlight off the most important thing, which were the teachings of the Buddha, which is what she was there to do, what she was there to provide. So instead of doing some kind of regular obituary, I decided that the best thing to do was just to collect these stories together and print them all into an article, which we did both in our house journal, Zen Traces, and also the Buddhist Society journal, The Middle Way. And that was published, I think, in autumn 2007. And in fact, we had a bit of we were able to have a bit of a I was able to have a bit of a sit down with some of the senior teachers and people and disciples of hers, so we could collect all the stories together as much as we possibly could. So basically what I've done is just select a few of those for this evening, and we'll just go through some until we come to the end and see how we go. So to begin with, a few biographical details just to place it into context. She was Austrian by birth, and she was born in the southeastern part of Austria, close to the border with Hungary and Slovenia. And she was born in 1921. So if you know your history, she lived through, shall we say, interesting times. in Austria. And these certainly left a deep impression on her. One of the things that used to irritate her students very, very much is how much she eschewed any form of good cause. And she was very wary about becoming involved in ideologies or politics or anything, and she made an absolute principle of not being involved in anything to do with that. She felt that it was too easy for the passions to become inflamed, and also that if you have faith in the Buddha's message, then the Buddha provides the medicine, and that's what we should pay attention to. As I say, she began teaching. Well, she trained in the 1960s, but she began teaching in London in the 70s and 80s. As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of the young people, as we were when we went, were all quite ideological of this, that, and the other, and she would not have anything to do with it at all. She absolutely refused to get drawn into any of it, because she had seen with her own eyes just the damage that the passions can do, particularly collectively, but also individually as well. And she was just very skeptical. Let's put it like that. Anyway, she came from, as I say, this very sort of rural part of Austria. The province is called Styria. And I mean, Austria, if you've been there, you will know that it's a pretty rural country anyway. It's very agricultural, and the people there are, real country folk. And she was very proud of that. She although predominantly it's a Catholic country, she used to call it pagan Catholic, pagan in the original sense of being of the country or from the countryside. And she was very clear that the people there were very close to the earth, not educated particularly, certainly not in an academic way, but they had an innate wisdom that can come from people who do live close to the earth and do live close to nature. They don't necessarily put a name on it, they don't necessarily call it anything special, but there just seems to be what she used to call the informing information that used to come in. And she said that it made a deep impression on her when she moved away, because she moved to England after the Second World War. She'd always been very, very keen on England. She said, maybe it's a previous life, I don't know. She said, but I've always been a sort of real Anglophile. And so she moved after, as I say, I think about 1950, or late 40s. She moved to England and to London, and shortly after sort of joined the Buddhist Society. But she said, reminiscing about her early years in Austria, she said, that the difference for those people and how they lived, and for how we live now, particularly, if you live in a city or a large town, and we're used to the sort of hustle and bustle. She said it would be perfectly normal on a Sunday. Obviously, everybody went to church, and then they went home and had their Sunday lunch. Then afterwards, if it was a fine day, they would sit either on the veranda as a family, or they would sit under a tree in the shade, and they wouldn't talk. They would just sit there upright, very quietly. And she said this was, of course, no one would dream of calling it meditation or something, like Zazen or whatever. But she said, in effect, it was something along those lines, that they were quite happy just to let their minds and their bodies just rest as they were. And they didn't have this tendency to always be ruminating on this, that, and the other. And she used to tell a story that in the 1950s, this obviously in London, if you were interested in Buddhism, well, obviously this was pre-internet by a long way, and actually there weren't that many books on Buddhism available in English. So anything that they could get their hands on, they did. But the big question that they really wanted to have answered for them is, can Westerners, and this was for the Zen group, can Westerners train in Zen Buddhism? And this is what they really wanted to know. And the reason that they weren't sure is because Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, wrote a foreword to one of the books by the famous Zen writer D.T. Suzuki, where he basically said that this is all well and good and it's fascinating, but it doesn't suit the Western psyche. And so everybody now thought, oh, well, maybe Buddhism is not for Westerners at all. So again, you have to remember there were no monks, or Buddhist monks or nuns in the country at all, and people did not sit meditation. In fact, the rumor was that if you sat meditation unsupervised, you could go horribly mad and maybe even die. It was, if you remember all those, and so people were very frightened to do it. She told a story that when in the 1950s, two bhikkhus came over. I can't remember if it was from Burma or Sri Lanka, and they decided to run a weekend retreat at one of the Oxford colleges. And of course, people from the Buddhist Society signed up. She didn't go on this particular one, but she knew the people who did. And there was one chap who had signed up, and so the idea was that, they would go catch the train on Friday, and they would start in the evening, and they would go through to Sunday, and then come home. And so this chap had sort of signed up, and he got to Paddington Station or whatever, bought his ticket, got on the train, when he suddenly became aware of a throbbing in his jaw. And by the time the train pulled into Oxford, it had begun to inflame, it had begun to swell, and he looked in and he could feel there was a gum boil, an abscess in his mouth. Anyway, he struggled on, and he stayed over the Friday night, but by the Saturday morning, after pretty much a sleepless night, this whole thing was red and hot and clearly very infected. And so he made a phone call to his dentist and got an emergency appointment for later on the Saturday. And so went to the bhikkhu and said, I'm really sorry, so my apologies, but I'm going to have to go home to attend to this. And he said, yes, of course. So he ordered a taxi from the college to Oxford Station. By the time he bought the ticket, he noticed the pain had stopped. And by the time he arrived back in London, the swelling had completely gone. There was no sign of the gum boil at all. And that gives you a real sense of just how powerful those unconscious forces are. Clearly, people really did believe that, this was, if you meditate, you really could go bonk, you really could go mad, and it could be really dangerous. And if that unconscious fear can produce psychosomatic symptoms, which is of course what that was, there you go. So it just shows not only it was a very different world Buddhistically here in the West in the 1940s and 50s than it is today. Nowadays, people are really interested in meditation. To be honest, they're only half interested in the Buddha Dharma itself, but they want to meditate. But it was the complete reverse back in the 50s. So this was the sort of world that she sort of came into. And the other story that she used to tell, just tagging on to that, sitting peacefully under the tree, quietly not saying anything, is that again in the towards the end of that decade, Christmas Humphreys, who founded the Buddhist Society, he invited a Zen priest called Ogata-san to come because he could speak a little bit of English, and he was the first Zen priest that they had met. Christmas Humphreys did a lot of travelling, so he had met him obviously in Japan, but otherwise the group in London had never met a Zen priest before, so they were all on the edge of their seats because, as I said, this is what they wanted to know. And so Ogata-san gave his talk and he addressed this issue. Can Westerners train in Zen? And he said, in my opinion, he said, I see no reason at all why Westerners should not be able to train in Zen Buddhism, in the Zen tradition. He said, there is just one thing, he said, that I've noticed with Westerners that will be something of an obstacle for them, not insurmountable, but to pay attention to, and that is your tendency for pranning. And they all said, well, that's great news that we can practice Zen, but what is this pranning? we need to know what this planning is if we're going to sort this problem out. Well, Christmas Humphreys, who sort of gave the vote of thanks at the end and was rather used to Ogata-san's accent, said, and of course Ogata-san tells us that we can indeed, Westerners can practice Zen Buddhism, but we are obstructed by a strong tendency for planning. And they all went, now we know what it is. But we don't plan. We don't plan at all. And it wasn't until she'd been into Japan for a little while and it's, was well ensconced in her own training that she suddenly realized, oh my goodness, yes we do. Because here we were, giving ourselves wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. But in fact, half my mind's on the next thing that needs to be done, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one. And so this goes on. And so this is how I find it very difficult to really let go. To really let go and just allow the heart to settle down. And anyone who's done, enough meditation will also know that this process is a very unconscious one. When we sit in meditation, and whatever you use as the sort of object of meditation, whether it's just the breath itself or whether you put a count on the breath, something like that, you will know that with all that good intention, you never quite know when you become distracted. That when you first go off into a thought stream, all you know is 10 minutes later, boof, oh my goodness, I've been off on another thought stream, isn't it? But can you remember the moment or the first thought that set you off? Often not. And that's because the process of becoming distracted and the process of being carried away by a thought stream is a purely unconsciously driven one. And this is why we find it so difficult, because basically the machine is running at full pelt, and most of the time we're indulging it anyway. And of course, as we imprint the habit deeper and deeper, and then we suddenly think, oh, we can sit down and do meditation. Well, it's still the mechanism is still going because we've been feeding the tiger all day, and so it takes a while. This is why we find meditation quite difficult. Certainly to begin with. So that was one aspect. But I also remember her saying that actually before she went to Japan, before she even came to England, she said, I actually had two Zen masters in my life. The first one was the man who taught her horse riding, and the second one was her geology professor at Graz University. So the horse riding, so she was a keen horsewoman, and from quite a young age she learned to ride horses, and she was sent to this chap. She said he was quite a sort of foreboding figure, and he was not wealthy, which is unusual because horse riding even then was considered quite a sort of an elite sport and was well paid, But he had such a reputation that people were frightened of him, and so, or they didn't last very long. And she remembered saying to him, she said, if you were a little bit easier, you could actually make quite a bit of money. And he said quite gruffly, he said, I train people to ride horses, that's all I do. So no, I'm not here to make money, just to train people to ride horses. And my goodness, he really did, and he was apparently very, very good. But she said of the horse riding, she said, it stands us in really good stead because, horses, like human beings, are mammals. They're warm-blooded creatures. And so the emotional life of a horse and the emotional life of a human have an awful lot in common. Being that shared, not only are they mammals, they're also social creatures, just like human beings are as well. And so they have a lot of the same, if you could almost say, culture that we humans have as well, and face some of the sort of similar things. And she said they react in a very sort of similar way. She said one of the tasks that you have to do when you're learning to ride is they do this inside. I don't know the names of all these sort of things, so I should just have to describe them. But there is a square on the inside, and the horses and the riders are sort of going around the square. And the tutor, the teacher, stands in the middle, and he has a long whip with a little sort of tail at the end. And if you're not paying attention, then the whip will be held behind your back and go, like this, and the sound of it just pulls you together. It never touches you or the horse, but it's just the sound, and it brings you back. And she said the job was that you had to take the horse along one side and into the corner, and then you had to turn the horse 90 degrees and then walk along the next side, and then in the next corner turn again. And this is to really sort of develop the skill for the horse and the rider to really behave as one, because it's quite a hard movement to do. It's quite a hard maneuver to carry out. And also the horses don't like it very much. They don't like having to go into the corner and then having to turn and then walking along. So she said the tendency is that the horse wants to cut the corner and go round go round, not actually go in the corner. But the rider knows that the tutor's looking. So you come to the first corner and you go in and turn, and then you come along, and then you go to the second one. And the horse is a little bit resistant, but you just take him into the second corner. Then you come to the third corner, and by now it's a little bit tiring. The horse is really sort of pulling back, but you go into that third one. And then you come to the fourth one, and you realise that the tutor's looking the other direction. And so when the horse begins to cut, you just think, oh, well, And so the horse cuts the corner. And then you come back to the first one again. He goes into the corner again because you can't let him get away. And the second one, well, he did it the last time, so he does it this time. The third one, the same. But when he comes to the fourth one, there is no way that horse is going into that, because he got away with it before, and he knows he can get away with it again. And you can see him beginning to, and then suddenly you would hear that behind your back like this, and the horse would go into the fourth corner. And she said it really taught her something about that tendency for skiving off, basically, or for being sloppy with the discipline. And that stood her in good stead, particularly when she went to Japan. That all these sort of excuses begin to bubble up, and they sound very rational to begin with, but actually underneath them is just a desire that I don't want to do. I can't be bothered to do this. And so I say it's not important. It's not important. But it actually is important, because it means that the habit isn't well developed. And in the 6 paramitas, the practice formulation for in the Mahayana, there is the fourth one, which is devoted energy, virya. And this really pertains to this. It's about the application. And in Zen itself, we say that there are 3 requirements for Zen training. First, a great root of faith in the Buddha nature. Secondly, a great ball of doubt in I and my excuses. And the third one is called fierce determination, or great courage as well. It's the same propensity, that necessity to really be very thorough when we do this training and with what we do. So that was her first. That was her first Zen master, she said. Her second one, as I said, she went up to Graz University, and there she studied geology, which in fact in the end she got a PhD in it. Now this was, in the 1930s, late 1930s and into the 40s, and she was only the second woman to actually graduate from the university in geology. But she said her geology professor, her tutor, he was a small, quite thin, wiry man with a long beard. And one day he came in to the lecture hall, and he picked up a piece of chalk and he drew a line along the blackboard. And he turned to them and he said, "If I was to ask you if this was a straight line," he said, "some of you would say yes, and others would say no, it isn't. And it's quite possible that you can fall into dispute and that it could become quite heated about whether this is a straight line or not." And then he picked up the blackboard ruler, and he just held it up against the line. He said, "Now you know." And he said, "This is science." And it always reminded her, because of course when she came across that famous Kalama Sutta, the Kalama scripture in the Pali Canon, where the Buddha goes to a village which is very much on the sort of guru circuit, and he starts preaching, and they say, "Wait a minute. We had another guru in last week who said something quite different to you. And last month we had another guru in who said something quite different to either of you. So how do we know who's telling the truth?" And the Buddha commended them and said, very wise Kalamas. You should certainly not just take anything, even that I say, and I am the Buddha. You should not just take everything in that comes your way. And neither should you believe something because it is just the tradition. And you shouldn't believe something because it's a fashionable idea. And you shouldn't believe in something because you like the sound of it. None of these are good reasons. It said it is only when you apply them and you find for yourself, yes, this works, this leads to peace at heart, then you yourselves will know. And if it doesn't lead to peace at heart, then it can safely, peacefully be dropped, and you can walk away from it. So this was something, obviously, that I think a lot of people, certainly in the West, find very appealing. This idea that the sort of blind dogma type thing doesn't seem to be so much there in Buddhism. But it's quite interesting because I know several times people over the years, people have come up to me, obviously after talks and things like that, saying, "Oh, I do like that Kalama Sutta. I really do like it. That we try it for yourself. Don't just believe it." And I go, "Yes, it's true. Have you tried it?" People go, "No, not yet, but I'm building up to it." So it's sort of interesting. Yeah, we like that idea, but sometimes we can still find it difficult to actually just make the move and to really apply ourselves as well. So those are the first two that she had. And then, as I said, she came to London sometime, I think it was 1950, and was here for about 10 years. And she taught at the university, taught geology at the university in London. And then in 1960, she got the opportunity to go to Japan, where she began her own Zen training. And she was a laywoman to begin with. Now, it was incredibly rare. Even though, in America they had the beat poets, and there are people like, Ginsberg and Burroughs and other people who were very interested in the sort of Oriental religions type thing. And certainly people were interested in Zen in those days. Say, Daisetsu Suzuki had written a number of books, back in the 20s and 30s, and those were becoming more well-known as well. But even so, it was very rare for somebody to actually just up sticks and go to Japan. But she did, and there were others who were there as well, mainly from America at that time. And there was a temple that was run by a woman priest, an American, called Ruth Sasaki. So Ruth Sasaki, just very quickly, she was the widow of Sokian. Sokian was another Zen master who had taught in New York and founded the first Zen Institute of America in New York, which is still in existence. He was interned, being Japanese, obviously during the Second World War in America, and he died shortly after. And his widow, Ruth Sasaki, who was an American, as I say, she emigrated out to Japan, and she took over a small training temple. Basically, the idea was it was for Westerners, because Westerners were coming, they had to learn the language, they had to learn Japanese customs, and if they wanted to train, there was no alternative because no one spoke English, hardly. And so she ran this temple. So they would do a year or two with her, and she would teach them the chanting and zazen, and basically, how the Japanese, the good form and so forth, and how to behave, because Zen is very traditional as well. And then they would go up to one of the training sodos, such as Daitokuji or Myoshinji. And when Myokyo went there, the first thing they had to really get used to were the sleeping arrangements, because they don't sleep on beds. They sleep on futons on the floor. And these aren't the nice futons from the futon shop, with a nice thick K-pop, which are pretty tough on your back anyway. You've tried them. But these are the very thin ones. These are the thin futons that are just rolled up, and you just unroll it on the floor, and you lie on it. And she said, this coming from us, no one had slept on the futon ever. Everybody was used to beds. And so sleeping on the floor for people she was in her 40s. So, it was hard. And everybody complained of back pain. Everybody complained of back. And one by one, they would all traipse to Ruth Sasaki and moan about how hard it was sleeping on a futon. And she always replied in the same way. She said, well, she said, you just carry on doing it, because sooner or later, something's going to give, and it won't be the floor. And that taught her really that actually the body is incredibly adaptable. But often we don't give it time. We give up before the body has been allowed to find a way of getting used to it. And she told another story because later on, she, as I say, because she went up to Daitokuji, which is one of the great 5 training monasteries in Kyoto, and it's a male Zen monastery, so she couldn't live there. So she lived outside and would attend daily. And she had to get a flat, obviously, and she managed to get a flat, one that was quite close to Daitokuji. It was very traditional, sort of Japanese flat, which is it's a single room downstairs, and then one room upstairs as well, and you sort of climb up a ladder to get up and down. It's very basic. But upstairs in the bedroom, there was a very small bathroom that she used. But she said it was so cramped that every time she sort of bent down to the sink to sort of splash water in her face, she would bang the sort of small of her back on the towel rail that was behind her. And, you know, she would do this again and again. She said before very long, she said, I was black and blue from this blessed, rail. And I was beginning to think, maybe I'm just going to have to move out of here and find somewhere with a bigger bathroom. Anyway, a few months later, she had a visit of a couple from London whom she knew, and she, accommodated them. So she let them have the bedroom, and she slept downstairs. And on the first morning, when they came down for breakfast, the wife said, "Oh, how do you cope with that bathroom?" She said, "Every time I bend to splash water on my face, I bang my back on the towel rail." And she said it suddenly hit her. She said, "I used to do that, but I haven't done that for months." And she'd completely forgotten about it, but somehow she had adapted to the space. Without consciously deciding to do it, her body had found a way of remembering, even though she consciously did not remember at all, but she just did it. And she said this really, awoke in her this awareness of a natural wisdom of the body that is there, and that is to be explored as well. And this is why in the Zen training we place a great emphasis on training with the body. So a lot of the tasks that are done in the temple, and this is true for really all traditions, it's not just the Zen thing, there's a lot of emphasis on physical work. Now I remember, I think it was Ajahn Sumedho, I think, told me, he said, Ajahn Chah would get his sort of Western students literally to do the old army thing, dig a hole and then fill it in, and then dig it out again, and then fill it in again. And of course, they would say, "Why are we doing this?" He said, "To teach you not to grasp at results." Because you think, when you've dug a hole, you think, "Oh, I've done it, I've done the job. Right, now fill it in." Okay, I filled it in, now what? Dig it out again. So that it de-emphasizes the goal, and instead the emphasis is on the doing. So it becomes, whether you use the term mindfulness, I prefer the term the practice of giving myself wholeheartedly into the doing. That becomes the thing. That becomes part of the process of what it is, rather than the grasping at the end result all the time, which causes a feeling of separation. I am evaluating. I'm standing apart from the doing and looking at it and judging. How close are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Type thing. So this was when we're one with the processes of the body, then the wisdom of the body can become more visible to us, and we can see how the body can operate in that way. One other thing she pointed out, she said the other thing as well is that one learns to work with the energies of the body as well, particularly through the passions. So when she first went to university in Graz, she obviously got some digs, student digs, and she went with her father because she was a woman and there weren't many women at all in the university, full stop. The father accompanied her to Graz, and they found, a sort of boarding house. Basically, it was run by the landlady who had students there, and she ran a very, proper house. Obviously used to young students who could be a bit boisterous, and she, cracked the whip, as it were, and kept them all, in line. So she had a long list of rules. What time you had to be in, and what time the meals were, and if you were late, you didn't get them, and all this sort of thing as well. And so she was, as she was showing them around, she was sort of reciting all these rules, and then she said, and she won't, she will have to be in at this time, and she'll have to be at the university at this time. And the father stopped her and said, for my daughter, he said, there will be no timetable like this at all. You will just give her the front door key. And she will come and go as she wishes, because she knows that if she fails her exams at the end of the year, she will be apprenticed to the seamstress in the local village. And of course, she said, sewing was the one thing she truly despised. So her father, knowing her very well, knew perfectly well with this sword hanging over her head that she was definitely going to keep her nose clean, which obviously she did. But anyway, keeping that in mind, that she hated sewing, she said that what she found when it came to sort of, particularly working with the emotional side, because she made a great emphasis on this, and it's something that is very true, that in our practice, in any Buddhist practice, if we do not take into account working with the fires, working with the passions, working with the emotions, what I call the three poisons I know in Tibetan Buddhism, then no real lasting transformation can take place. And it's all very well to be able to hold your hands correctly and to bow correctly and so forth. But if the passions aren't brought in, aren't trained, then as soon as the passions flare up, they will upset the whole equilibrium, and the whole thing will fall apart very quickly. And I'll tell another little story on that after this one. But anyway, she said that, and this is sort of back in the day. I know now, if socks get a hole in, people generally just throw them away and buy another pair from Primark. But back in the day, you darned your socks and you repaired your clothes as well. And so, but she, it was, when you have a task and you don't really want to do it, you let it sort of pile up until you really have to. And she said, so she always had a little pile of darning, socks that needed darning. And she said, I would wait until something upset me, or I got into a bit of a mood or a strop about something. She said, and as soon as that energy was there in her, where she was, annoyed about something, she said, I would sit myself down, thread a needle, and I would darn those socks. She said, you may as well, because if you're in a grumpy mood, you might as well do a horrible chore that you don't like, because it's not going to make any difference. But she said the other thing is that if once you really get into it, that energy of the passion, or whatever it is, transforms into the energy of the labor as well. She said nothing can dance socks as well as an angry demon, as a fighting demon. And so, but this really showed her that actually that root energy, we might call it anger, we might call it desire, but these are the forms the energy takes. But at root, it is just heart energy. It's just the energy of the Buddha heart, or the energy of the Buddha nature. And it can transform itself very quickly. And you see it in children. I mean, you can see it, if a small child can go from tears at having his, the sweet taken away, or whatever it is, and can then turn into laughter in a split second, once everything's calmed down. Even still with tears on the cheeks, it can be laughing its head off. That energy can transform completely quickly like that, like a lightning flash. And discovering that and being able to shift it is very, is a very important thing that we learn to do, in the training. again, she used to say when she was in Daitokuji, she said, the head monks or the jiki and all the sort of senior, they all had very loud shouts. And she said, it may sound a little bit cruel at first, but she said, my goodness, it does work. She said, just when you dash through a door and you let it slam behind you, and suddenly they'll be like this, it goes right in. Now, you could be told 100 times, do not slam the door, do not slam the door, and you'll still do it. But the next time you rush through the door and the door's just about to slam, suddenly it comes up and you turn and you grab the door handle and then you close it quietly. So yeah, it can save a lot of time, even though it's slightly more sort of rough treatment. So after she had, oh yes, I was just going to tell you that other story. So a friend of mine actually, who is in the Zen group, she is an illustrator. She's a very, very good artist, and she spent many, many years as a project, as a sort of religious project, spiritual project, illuminating the Lotus Sutra, both hand calligraphy, but also illustrations for it as well. She did a beautiful job. It took her about 16 years to do it. But anyway, during that time, she was invited to go to a sort of workshop at the British Library in London for people from any religion who were involved in the illumination of manuscripts or of any sort. And when she was there, she met an American artist who had learned Chinese brush painting. So if you've seen Chinese brush painting, it's very similar. They have the large brush, and they often do some calligraphy, so it would be like a verse or poem, and then there will be an illustration, maybe a landscape, maybe bamboo or something like that, to illustrate it. And that you can often see these then they get put up onto scrolls and things like that. It's very, very beautiful. And she wanted to learn this. Now she was already an artist, obviously, when she decided to retrain as a Chinese brush painting. And she went to a Chinese teacher who was, again, very traditional. And she said, well, will you take me on? And she said, yes, of course, that's fine. So I had the first lesson. And she said, right, I'm going to teach you how to paint a leaf. And so she showed her how to hold the brush and put the paper correct and to get the ink, the right consistency. And she said, okay, you do it like this. It's 3 lines. Central line, 1 on one side, 1 on the other, and there you go. So she said, so she gave her the brush and she said, just do the same thing. So she did. She said, okay. She said, but if you see here, this right hand stroke it's a bit thin and it's a bit inconsistent. So do it again. So she did it again. Yes. Now, okay, you can see it's sort of bold at the bottom a little bit, so you need to even it up. And anyway, by the time she'd done a whole page of these, the teacher said, okay, that's better. Go home and practice this every day and come back in 1 month. And so she did, and she came back in a month and she gave her the brush and the paper and she drew the leaf and she said, it's better, but you can see, and she made a correction and got her to do it again. And by the time she'd done a page full of leaves, she was happy and she said, okay, come back in a month, practice every day, 15, 20 minutes, and then come back. Well, this went on for 6 months. She was drawing this leaf. Now remember, she was already an accomplished artist in her own right. But by the end of the 6 months, the teacher gave her the brush and she said, yes, you've got it, that's fine. She said, now you've learned the most important thing. She said, and that is consistency. She said, it won't take you as long to paint bamboo and persimmons and the mountains and all the rest. Now that's just technique. But this level, this equilibrium, she said, if I was to wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning and put a brush in your hand and a piece of paper and say, draw a leaf, she said, even in your soporific state, with your eyes shut, you would be able to do this. She said, if you've had an argument, if you've been told the best news or the worst news, and then someone puts a brush in your hand, it'll make no difference because those emotions will not get in the way of the brush. And that's what you have learned. And she said, it's true. She said, I went through every feeling in the book many times in that 6 months. You know, the frustration, the impatience, the disappointment, but she got back onto it. She just kept going, and eventually it comes. Eventually it smooths out that consistency. And that's really the transformation that is being sought in this way. So when she was there, she trained under two very eminent teachers. One was, they were both obviously the Lord High Abbots of Daitokuji. Her first teacher was Master Sesso, so that was from 60 to 66, and then he died. And then there's a sort of 9-month interregnum, and then the next one took over Sojun Canon Roshi, and he completed her training and gave her Inca in 1972. And they were both very different types of men, both very much Zen men, but temperament and character-wise were very different. Sesso Roshi was very gentle, and it's said that he had gold on his lips, that when he spoke he was thoroughly charming in that way. But Sojun Roshi was as fierce as a tiger, and in fact, so much so, in fact, well, after, I'll have to tell the story a bit backwards, but after Sesso had died, she wasn't sure whether she wanted to continue her training under Sojun Roshi because he had such a reputation. And actually, he wasn't sure he wanted to train her either, because Westerners had got such a poor reputation by that point. It was the middle 60s. I mean, people were turning up, and for Zazen high on LSD, and they were falling off the cushions and hallucinating and everything, or drunk or whatever. And this had really, they just said, well, these people aren't serious. But actually, Soko Morinaga Roshi was able to sort of negotiate and act as a go-between, and finally, he did accept her. And she wasn't sure, as I say, but she said the turning point for her was one morning when she was coming in for the chanting. First thing in the morning, it was sort of must have been sort of spring, and she was behind him, and he couldn't see her, but he sort of walked up the steps to the entrance to the temple, and he turned around and looked at the rising sun, the sun as it was coming up, and he smiled, and he wasn't aware that she was there, and suddenly that fierceness was gone, and she saw the warmth in his face, and she said, "No, you'll be okay. You will be okay. Now that I know that that's there in you." Anyway, so she did her training with him. But the one thing she always said that she heard more than anything else from both of them was the phrase, "Just look at the place where your own feet stand." Now, when I started training with her, she used to use not that phrase, but she would say, "Just give yourself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done." And this was the very definition of the Zen daily life practice. She never used the term mindfulness. She didn't like it because she thought the problem was our minds were already too full, and that actually what we needed to do was to empty them out and to provide that quiet spaciousness so that the world can come in and we can meet the world in the heart. But for her, this is what the way that it was put by her teacher: just look at the place where your own feet stand. And she said, to begin with, I used to say, but what is it that I'm supposed to be looking for then? And they would just say, just look at the place where your own feet stand. Yes, but if you don't tell me what I'm supposed to be looking for, how will I know? If I see it, I might miss. Just look at the place where your own feet stand. And so this went on. And she said, but then came the point when she really did begin to look down at the place where her own feet stand. And it was at that moment that a little voice inside came up and said, "Better not." She never said too much about that "better not," but actually, if we are serious about the training, sooner or later we all meet that "better not." What is that "better not"? Well, we come in and we hear about things like mindfulness and awareness and consciousness and cosmic consciousness, and it all sounds very good. It all sounds lots of fun. That sounds like I'd want a slice of that. Yes, please. But what we often don't realize is that as that awareness does begin to develop, the first things we come across are the ugly truths about myself. The things that I've kept from myself because they rather spoil my self-image. And they're not the things that I want to see. And these are the things that are repressed, that are pushed down into the unconscious in order to preserve my image of myself. And I always remember at one of the Buddhist Society summer schools, when there was a chap I know who was still in the group actually, he came up to me and he said, God, he said, Martin, he said, you know, I've always thought of myself as a very sort of liberal type person, very tolerant, you know, very understanding and all this sort of stuff. He said, but recently I've become aware I'm actually very narrow-minded and something of a bigot. I said, what do you mean? He said, if someone doesn't agree with me, I really can't stand it. I said, yeah, that's right. I said, that's the thing. But, you know, we label ourselves with these things and think, oh, I'm such a good fellow. But then we are very good at hiding those more unpleasant truths from ourselves in that way. And so this is where that better not, because there's a reason that we tend not to be scrupulous, that we tend to avoid the practice. Quite often we come up with reasons for why, oh, not just now, or I'm too busy, or whatever, because it might reveal something, or there's something in us that might be revealed in us that I don't particularly want to see. So, yeah. One other story that I think is, because we're coming towards the end now, but one of the stories that she used to tell, because she had this phrase, hatching it out. She would often use that. She said it's a method that she has used all throughout her life on many, many sort of occasions. And she says it's never let me down. It's worked really well. Now, I told you that she had this little flat, this Japanese flat that was quite close to Daitokuchi. And it was really useful for her because she was working as well. She was teaching English as a foreign language as well. So she would work during the day. But she had to go to the temple first thing in the morning. By first thing in the morning, like about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning for morning zazen and interviews. And then she would go to work. She got this flat. But before that, she'd had this another one that was a bit further away. And she was always very prone to the cold. Now, Japanese homes don't have central heating. They didn't then. They do now. But they didn't then. The temples certainly don't have central heating. But she did have a little wood-burning stove. And she said, God, I used to sit in front of that at, 3 o'clock in the morning, hugging it, drinking a cup of coffee before I sort of steel myself to rush out down through the snow to the temple at the very last minute, and would just get into the temple just before they closed the doors for the morning zazen. She said, but I always discovered that as soon as I was in the temple, all of that concern would fall away. She said it because you had no choice anymore. It was cold. What are you going to do about it? There's no choice about the wood-burning stove or not. You were there now. And she said it really brought home to me the truth of the Four Noble Truths, that my goodness, we do create rods for our own back because I don't want to let go of my wishes, of how I want things to be. But it's that actually causes the upset. When we can learn to let go of those things a little bit better, then actually it's amazing what the body can truly tolerate with that. And it becomes something different. Anyway, so she had moved into this, and now in Japan, and again, I don't know if it's still the case, but in the past, when you move into rented accommodation, you pay what's called key money, which is like a deposit, but it's non-refundable. And it's quite a lot of money. So it encourages people not to move about too much. So once you move into a place, you've given this large lump of money to the landlord, plus you pay a monthly rent. But the longer you stay there, then obviously the key money becomes less of an issue, because if you're there for several years, etc., it becomes that. But if you're constantly moving, you're paying these large sums of money. So it encourages people to stay put. So she found this place that was just ideal. And then shortly after that, Cesar Roshi died. This in 66. And there was this interregnum. And when Christmas Humphreys, who was basically sponsoring a certain amount, heard about this, he wrote to her and saying, well, you better come back to London and you can talk to the Zen group about your time. And she didn't want to go back, partly because she was settled in Japan, and the other because she'd just paid a lot of money to move into this flat, and it would mean losing it. But Christmas Humphreys sort of trumped her by sending her plane tickets for London. So she, oh God, I'm going to have to go. And she thought, but I really don't want to lose this flat. She knew she was coming back in about 6 or 8 months, but what was she going to do? So she went to the university in Kyoto, and she advertised to see if she could find a tenant so she could sublet it, but nobody came. And she thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? So she did what she said she always did, which was this hatching it out. She said, I basically just hole myself up in my room for 3 days. She said, it usually takes that amount of time, and just sit on it and literally like a mother hen on an egg, hatch out this problem. Like this. There are 2 conflicting desires. In this case, one is that she didn't want to lose the flat, and the other is that she couldn't she couldn't not go back to London because Christmas Humphreys had sent her this ticket. But she was going to return, so what was she going to do? What was she going to do? And she said, on the 3rd day, she said, you can predict it. She said, suddenly this blinding revelation. She said, my goodness, what the heck am I doing? All this time we've been talking about Zen and more Zen and Buddhism and so forth. And how did the Buddha refer to his monks? He referred to them as leavers of home, leavers from home. The whole point is they left the domestic life and went into the community, into the Buddhist community. And in fact, the Zen monks are called unsui, which means cloud water, which means that they have no home at all, this idea. And she said, here I am in that dilemma, and I'm clinging to this. I'm clinging to this home. And it was at that had just fallen off in that moment. So she went over to the agency, and she said, I'm handing the key in because I'm moving out. I'm going to England for a number of months, and I'll be back. And they said, well, you're going to lose the key money. And she said, yes, I know that, but there we go. So she handed in her notice there and then. And she said it was like a weight off her shoulders, that whole problem now. The sense of relief really flooded her. And so she walked back across the square to where her flat was, where her apartment was. And sitting on her doorstep was this very tall American who stood up and said, are you still looking for a tenant? And she said, come with me. So they went straight back to the agency, and she said, I've changed my mind. I'd like you to meet my new tenant. She said, and that was the problem. She said, you can't always guarantee that the Dharma will work quite that way. But she said, I've never sort of found that it's let me down. She said, when you take, and the point she wanted to make with the telling of this and other stories, is that when you take the Dharma seriously, it will take you seriously as well. And things will just come together in ways that you really couldn't imagine, until it actually happens. But if you try and bargain with it, or you try to, second guess it, it doesn't work. You really have to let go. You really have to let go for that, as it were, the magic, quote unquote, to really take place. Well, I'll finish because we're coming to the end. We've spoken for an hour, which I think is probably enough. But I'll just tell you one last little anecdote, which happened. Obviously, as I said, I met her in '88, and I was living in Shobuan although she was up in Fairlight in Luton until she died in 2007. And I think it was the last meeting I had with her. So she had a 9-month period where she became very ill. She suffered a fall and became bedridden. She was bedridden for 9 months before she actually died. And I do remember, actually, this is it's not really pertinent to the story, but it was quite interesting, just something she told me. When I first saw her, after she became bedridden, and obviously I'd heard that she'd had this fall, I was with her, obviously, because I was incumbent. I was teacher in residence at Sherborne, so I used to have one-on-one meetings with her anyway. And she said, "Oh, I thought I'd tell you." She said, "I knew something was going to happen." I said, "Why? How did you know?" She said, "A couple of days before the fall," she says, "I was reading the newspaper in my study, and I looked up, and there was a man standing there. He was very well dressed, and he was looking at me, and I looked at him, and he stood there for about 2 minutes, and then he vanished. And he said, I thought something was going to happen." So that was apropos of nothing. But anyway, I thought I'd tell you that. But anyway, what she said to me the last time, she said, she said, "These forms, they come and go, but life, that goes on." And I pondered that, because actually what she was saying was not, she wasn't saying it in a sort of a life goes on type thing. What she was really saying was that the problem is that we identify with these forms. And we think we are these forms, but we're not. We are the life that flows through them. And the life that she referred to wasn't life with a small l, lowercase, but with a capital L. And that our small l lives are always, all the time, part of that greater life with a capital L. And it's that greater life that informs the smaller life as well. And to remember that we are that life, and not just the individual forms that we are inhabiting now, and that flow from one to the other, one form to the other form to the other form. And we fulfill our role in these small L lives, but that simultaneously is part of the great life at the same time. And always to remember that. And I have to say, this is a great time of year to see that, because you go outside now and you can see some of the flowering trees again, and you think, it was only a few weeks ago that those tree branches were all bare. They were all bare, or they had maybe a few little buds, but otherwise they were all bare. There's no leaves. And now we know that process is starting again. We are part of that cycle. We think that we are separate from it, or we stand apart, but we don't. We are very much part of that cycle, and our lives should be seen in that way. Okay, so we'll leave that there for now. That's the end of the talk. And I think we'll just have a few minutes sitting, and then we can have an opportunity for any questions. Yes.
Recording in progress.
Okay, there we go. So if, obviously in the room, you can just put your hand up, but otherwise, I think if you're online, I just unmute yourself and shout out. Yes.
I'll put two things together and you just respond to each one. So you mentioned things put in the background, and I'll call that shadow.
Yes.
Okay, colour.
Yes.
So integration, acceptance. So I'll put loads of figures in. I switched them on basically a lot until anger. So that was gone. So then quiet, boom, boom. And the anger comes as an energy, and then it separates, and then you perceive energy. But to the external user, you don't see that you still got anger again. So you have anger and you don't. So as things come up, you integrate, or integration, or intuition, as we call it. The other thing is, so you create a life that I'll call it soul. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So would you, within what you understand, do you think with the soul's there, or the greater L is there, for suffering? forward through the suffering.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is something the Buddha himself said. I mean, the Buddha. Again, I sort of tell the joke, and I've told it here many times, that if anybody ever asks you at a party, oh, you're a Buddhist, what did the Buddha teach? Then you can always just say, suffering and the way out of suffering. Just leave it there. If they're interested, they'll ask you more questions. If they're not, they'll move on to sport, and that's fine. But it literally, in a nutshell, it is. And the Buddha said that it's not just suffering, but the way out of suffering is through it, not by running away from it or escaping it. Yeah.
And there's this concept where maybe some are put on the planet to make others. There's a dynamic between there's almost certain people are sufferer generators, and the other one is here to suffer the suffering to evolve.
Everybody suffers.
That's true.
Everybody suffers.
That's true.
Some more than others, but everybody experiences suffering. That I would say is a universal. And a little bit, I mean, I have heard of those things before. It's not a tack that the Buddha took because it's too intentional. I don't think. What I mean is that there isn't a creator or a blueprint for this. The Buddha never talked about that at all. It's not something that the Buddha himself taught. I am aware that some people do take that tack. But just to say.
I can see each way. And the other thing was to do with, I call it like synchronicity, or things that occur.
Yeah.
Or you surrender to a path. And I've seen this in myself. The trouble is, occasionally I want it, and then it's like meditation. If you want it, it ceases to
drives it away. Exactly.
And then things, it's like you're almost resonating with the correct path, and weird things happen. Yeah. I've seen that within myself, but I've lost it.
I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I think synchronicity is one of Carl Jung's quite more popular concepts because everybody's experienced it, pretty much. I mean, at some point in their lives, everybody's had something synchronous happen and think, oh my goodness, that was startling. And it does feel, and it's accompanied by that sense that somehow there is a falling into place that happens from time to time with things. And when it happens, it's really quite, it always produces a bit of shock or sort of
because
like
it's
awe.
quite often something you wouldn't expect.
Totally.
And
It almost has
in the direction you maybe in that way you're heading.
Yeah, but it always gives that sense that life is greater. And I think, certainly in my own experience of synchronicity, you always walk away thinking, oh gosh, here I was sort of toiling away. And suddenly you realise that actually, the circumstances or life itself has a bigger part to play. And there's a feeling of being having a place in the universe almost. The thing is with those elements is that you cannot write a book. I mean, so talking about shadow work and integrating shadow work is very popular, but there's no formula for it. You can't. And not only that, the whole point of the shadow is that it cannot be anticipated because it's unconscious. Until it appears, you don't know what it is. Because it really, as Carl Jung used to say, the unconscious truly is unconscious. And so you cannot anticipate it at all. And so it always has to take us by surprise. So yes. But I think what is important is that we can prepare the ground for it. So what our practices do, and so for example, if you're following a formula like whether it's the Noble Eightfold Path or the 6 parameters, if you have a discipline, then these experiences can happen within that discipline, and within that practice, and as it were, you can, this is the whole thing in Zen about sort of what's called gradual or sudden enlightenment. You cannot anticipate it because enlightenment too is an unconscious process, obviously, and you don't know what it's going to be or if and when it's going to happen either. But you're preparing the ground for it through the practice. This has been a debate actually in Zen, where people like Master Rinzai said, all these practices have nothing to do with enlightenment at all. But yet the Buddha taught them, so that they're obviously needful, but they don't actually, strictly speaking, they don't produce enlightenment. They produce a conducive ground or vessel within which the process can take place, if that makes sense.
Right, I put it to anger, I didn't have, and then it came up. Then a few times, then within practice I had, it generated separation. So that's how I say the practice has helped, in that it helped with that. Now I feel it, but it doesn't act. But it didn't.
Yes.
When that came up as part of my shadow, no anger,
Yeah.
huge anger, then
Yeah.
the separation, I think the practice was the thing of very, very quickly having that internal observation, because we do a lot of internal, and then seeing it as an emotion, but then that separation was very quickly there.
So
I suppose that's where I'd say the practice is held. Obviously, what shadow comes out of shadow.
yeah, absolutely.
You can't say, but it helps
No.
with separation.
But you're providing a
I
vessel.
don't use the word control.
No, that would be the wrong emphasis.
That's wrong.
But that's what I'm talking about. There you are as the vessel, and you have certain practice that allows that vessel to be the containing structure. I mean, if I go back to the hatching it out method that Myokyo advocated. I mean, she used it on there are a number of stories where she talks about it. But in the one that I told you, there was a process that she had to go through, and she knew she had to go through it. And that's why she holds herself up for 3 days, like the mother hen sitting on the egg. And that's why it's called hatching it out. So you don't know when the lightning is going to strike, or when the moment of, in that case, the moment that something had to be let go. Because the problem was she had these two things that were in conflict. So you cannot just consciously say, right, okay, I'm going to let go of my desire to have this flat because it suits me down to the ground. Because you're going to be bereft. You're going to think, no, I don't want to do that. I really don't want to do that. You can't, because that's not how a desire grabs us. We don't have the desire. The desire has us. And so you cannot consciously let go of a desire. It's just there. It's an unconsciously driven thing. And so it has to go through a process whereby the dropping off happens of itself. And in that falling away, the resolution comes. The resolution happens, if that makes sense. So that was the process of hatching it. And that was her practice. You discussed yours, you talked about yours. That was the one that she used as well. So, and in that, all that stuff can come up. But it's allowed to exist. And, in the practice of working with the fires, the important thing is not to judge it. That the feeling or the passion itself, because if I start judging it, then I start pushing it away. I start, as you said, that's the control. I want to control it. It's inevitable because it's too strong. A powerful passion is frightening, actually. We suffer. We suffer the passion. I mean, if you think that the word emotion, the English word emotion, and the verb to motivate have the same root basis, because that's what an emotion does. An emotion is trying to get us to act. So if you really want something, if you didn't want it, you just sit there. But if you suddenly think, God, I'm thirsty as hell, really thirsty, you have to get up and go and get a glass of water. That's what the desire is trying to get you to do. When you're angry, you're trying to get rid of something that you find that you strongly don't want to be in the presence of, or that you want to exist, for example. And so, woof, it lashes out in that way. That's what an emotion does. So to contain that impulse, requires a great deal of resilience and a lot of inner strength as well, which is what we are doing with our practice. But it also is necessary because that fire then burns away the attachment. And then comes to the point when it's so subtle, it just drops off. But that is a process that has to happen by itself. I cannot make that happen. But what I have to do is to suffer it out. And that's where the resilience through suffering appears.
I think Jeff had a question, but is there anyone online who would like to?
Anyone wanted to ask a question online?
All good.
We're all good?
Okay, Jeff had a...
Please, I wanted to ask you, Martin, about in Zen Buddhism, is the concept of a pure land, as in, say, the practice in Tibetan Buddhism of Chen Rezig. So, but, on many occasions, if there's somebody in our group who's died or somebody we know of, and we wish, I think it's always the case when somebody dies, we want to ensure that we help them on whatever path lies ahead. So we do the Chen Rezig practice, the Avalokiteshvara mantra, etc., to try to help the deceased person. So is this a practice that's within Zen Buddhism as well, this idea of sending the deceased to a pure land where they can receive perfect teachings, a sort of blissful rest, you might say? And if there is, do you believe that your teacher went to the pure land?
So it's not put in quite that way. I mean, I'm familiar, obviously, with Tibetan Buddhism. For example, the Book of the Dead and the Bardo and so forth. We don't have that in Zen, but we do have. So when people die, I mean, the thing is, all Buddhism does death. If you go to a Buddhist country, they often say, if you go to Japan, for example, and you want to get married, or you go to the Shinto shrine, but when you die, it's the Buddhists who do death. Because that's what Buddhists do really well. It's death. So because of the impermanence, obviously. So we do chant for the dead. We do chant for the dead. Now, interesting, you mentioned the Pure Land with that, and obviously Pure Land Buddhism is massive in Japan, as it was very big in China as well.
I feel it was, yeah.
But it's not necessarily it's not strictly part of something in the Zen school per se.
No.
However, the thing is that the dividing line between the different schools of Buddhism are not the same as the dividing lines in denominations in Christianity. So, whether you believe in the Trinity or you don't believe in the Trinity might depend on which, denomination of Christianity you subscribe to. It's not quite like that in the Buddhist world with that. So, if you go to a Zen temple, it'll be because your family are connected with that temple, and it happens to be Zen. It could be, Huayan. It could be Nichiren. It could be also, there are or Shin Buddhism, for example. So it could be any number as well as a Zen temple. So you certainly get that. Now, actually, the sixth Zen patriarch, who was called Huineng in Chinese, and his Japanese name was Eino Daiken. He wrote a script called the Platform Sutra, and he talks about the Pure Land. And he says that the Pure Lands exist in the heart.
Yes.
But the heart, now people often think, oh, well then, so you're saying that the Pure Lands exist inside you.
Yeah.
But actually, the heart is a very nebulous term in Buddhism. It doesn't have a location. It's not just inside or outside. In fact, actually, it's everything and everywhere, because the heart is the seat of consciousness. So heart is the original Sanskrit term is chitta. In Chinese, it's shin, and in Japanese, it's kokoro. So this is the term that's often translated mind with a capital M that you find. So in Buddhism, this mind is we shouldn't think of it as something inside your skull. That's a very Western thing.
Yeah.
That consciousness exists inside here, and everything out there is unconscious. You know, this stuff is all unconscious. Consciousness has no location in Buddhism. If you have a look at the Yogacara, where they talk about the 8 consciousnesses, for example, or you even look at the 18 Dhatu as well, consciousness does not exist in a sense object. It doesn't exist in a sense organ. It exists when those two things come together and give rise to sensory consciousness. But sensory consciousness itself is not located anywhere. So, then in the Yogacara, there was this notion that you have what was called the storehouse consciousness. The storehouse consciousness is also non-local, but it gives rise to everything. So it gives rise to our own inner sensations, but it also gives rise to what we call the objective world. So in Yogacara, the mind actually divides itself into 4 parts. One part is your subjectivity, the other part is the object, the objective world, and then you have these 2 others, which are reflective consciousness. Anyway, don't need to go into that. But the point is that what we call the objective universe and your subjective experience are both part of mind, are both part of chitta or kokoro. So when we talk about the Pure Land, we're not talking about Australia or Japan.
No.
We are in this non-local realm.
Yeah.
So that's where so when the 6th Patriarch said it exists inside the heart, that's what he was saying. So the problem is when somebody dies, we think they go somewhere.
We do.
We don't go anywhere.
No.
But the dead are here.
Yeah.
With the living. It's just that they're invisible in that way. So the states of consciousness, again, because they're non-local, they're unconscious until they become visible, and then they're conscious in that way. So again, it's not that it's rather like nirvana and samsara. If you remember, originally it was thought you had to escape from samsara and then go to this place called nirvana. Then the Mahayanis came along and said, nirvana is samsara. Samsara is nirvana. The difference is whether it's perceived that way or not. So you get examples in the sutras. So, for example, in the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Buddha, was it Shariputra, one of his great disciples, says, "Oh, the world is full of horrible things and it's full of suffering." And the Buddha says, "No, it's not. It's a treasure house. It's beautiful." And he says, "No, but look, it looks horrible. It's full of thorns and pain and all this." And so the Buddha extends his big toe and touches the earth and transforms it for the whole company into this beautiful world. And he said, "Look, what you're seeing is the true nature of the world." And then he removes his toe and it all goes back to, samsara. He said, but it's always there. It's just that because of the delusion, you cannot see it. That's all. But it's always there. So, it's along those lines.
I would say every time I do the power, I develop a feeling of compassion for the deceased person or persons. And I have a strong feeling that I'm able to send energy to these beings who are in the fire.
Yes.
If it's somebody close to me, think about my wife's mum. Do that for her, for instance. After the ceremony, and I did it for my own mum, I had a strong feeling that they were okay.
Yeah.
And I felt in a very real sense it helped me with the grief process.
Yes.
Because I felt they were okay and we'd done something to help them, then it helped me get through the grief process and had a really nice feeling that they were okay.
Yes.
But whether that's a reality or not, I don't know. But it's a strong feeling. And when you have a strong feeling about something, it feels powerful and I think it feels beneficial.
Well, the thing is that here in the West, we have a very different way of seeing consciousness and matter and all those things. So we have a very different, understanding of how the world works. For a start, we're very convinced that, I am in here and you are all out there. That's not something Buddhism shares.
No.
So everything is interconnected to begin with. The dead and the living, you and your mother-in-law are always connected and always have been. So everything is, one thing is connected to it. So in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the way it puts it is that the one is in everything and everything is in the one. Quite literally in that way. Now, those things appear sort of contradictory because of our flawed way of seeing the world, which is in this duality, which is in this, I am in here and everything else is out there. So it's using the language of I that we're using now. It's very, this vision is something that goes beyond that. It's something that's very different. So as I sort of said, again, going back to the sixth patriarch, when he said, one of the chants we use for the dead in Zen is called the four great bodhisattva vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. The passions are manifold, I vow to gentle them all. The Buddha's teachings are many, I vow to learn them all. The Buddha's way is supreme, I vow to walk it to the end. Now that first one, the first of the great bodhisattva vows, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. And the sixth patriarch said, who do you think all these numberless beings are that are to be saved? He said they all exist in the heart. So again, everything exists in the heart. Everything, the living and the dead, everything exists in the heart. And so the reason for saying that, what he's saying is he's overcoming that divide. That normally that's how I see things. He's saying no, there is just the heart, and everything is in it. So the sentient beings that you're seeking to save with your bodhisattva vow, they're already here in the heart. So if you start doing your own training, because everything is in the heart, that bleeds out, that permeates out, that begins to perfume the heart, and thus all beings are gradually liberated through one's own efforts and the efforts of everyone and all the Buddhas as well. So it's all happening together. That's why, the bodhisattvas make the vow that they will not enter nirvana until all beings have been saved. That's the classic bodhisattva vow, isn't it? And the reason for that is because everything is interconnected. You can't have one thing doing something that doesn't affect everything in that way. So everything affects everything in the heart. It doesn't make sense to I. It doesn't have to. I mean, we sort of take it on faith because the Buddha taught it. That was why.
It just says there's a particular movement in quantum physics. I'll think of the name of it in a minute. That's kind of saying, in a way, what you're saying.
Is that entanglement?
That's part of it, And it's a branch of quantum physics. I was seeing you moment, I can't think of the name for it.
Right.
But it says something like, we think in the West that there was the Big Bang, matter came, it evolved, we evolved from that. But in this branch of quantum physics, they think or believe that consciousness came first, and energy and matter came from consciousness, and that we are all interconnected. Karen called it the collective consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's quite a nice idea. But I think even Western physics is really coming to see that this is the nature of things.
Yeah, scientists are always pitching stuff from
They
the
are.
East, aren't they?
I think what you've just described is really nice. I really like that.
I'll tell you, last year, what was it? I saw something must be on the BBC website or something, saying scientists have now finally proved that dogs and cats have consciousness.
Yes,
And
I
thought, ask any dog owner, ask any cat owner.
There was a vote in the House of Commons, wasn't there?
You think?
Did they really not realise?
That was a paper from the University of the Bleeding Obvious. That one.
Absolutely. I have this particular, I've been a student of 50 odd years. And when you dive, you can see that the fish, they're like us. They have feelings, don't they? They have fear.
Yes.
Yeah, they're like us.
As I said, that when I was telling the stories of the horses as well, that's horses are very good at anticipating what the riders are feeling, and they'll actually respond to that. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Otherwise, I think we're nearly 9 o'clock.
I think Alice has anything. Did you want to ask a Japanese cultural thing? William's got a long association with it.
Well, I was just reminded when you were talking about Bardo.
The bar, yeah.
Going to another paradise or another place after death.
Mm.
The Japanese do celebrate the Lantern Festival every year in the summer. It's usually in August.
Obon.
Obon, yeah. It's their biggest
It is.
festival and the largest movement of people travelling in Japan back to their homes to be with their family, like we do at Christmas time. They gather together and they go through various rituals, and I'm not sure whether it's just a comforting thing that they do, which is originating from Shinto, or whether it's a belief and how much it really belongs to Buddhism. But they, for example, they traditionally put a light or a candle in the window to guide their ancestors' spirits back to the home.
Yeah.
And they will sometimes lay an extra place at the table for the ancestor to be with them. And then there are various other rituals that they go through, visiting the family grave and paying respects, offerings, and at the end of the 2 or 3 days of Bon, they will go traditionally to a river, but it could be water, and float a lantern with a candle or a light inside, and on the traditionally paper lantern they would write the prayers and wishes in the names of their departed relatives, and will guide them as the lantern floats out along the river out to sea. It will guide them back to their peaceful paradise. And it's a very big thing, not only in Japan but in other Asian countries. So I just, in my mind, it seems to be that they've mixed up Shinto and Buddhism.
They have no problem with that. I mean, so for example, the priest who ordained me,
it's a cultural thing, isn't
yeah,
it? Rather than religious. Is that?
but they don't make that distinction. We make that distinction. I mean, until the middle of the 19th century, the Japanese didn't even have a word for religion. They only invented it once they came into contact with Westerners, because Westerners had the term religion. We separated out this idea of religion and then the secular world. Those were two different things. Nowhere else has that, because it's so integrated into the culture that this is just what everybody does. So that's what I mean when they don't have that sort of denominational thing in quite so much the way that our religions tend to. I mean, and I think there's, and what I think is interesting is that all Buddhist countries, if you look, whether it's Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma, originally China, and still very much China actually, and Japan as well, they have a strong ancestral veneration element that's always been part and parcel with, in Buddhist countries.
But wasn't it there before?
Yes, it was, but Buddhism just neatly, integrated with it. It has no, it's quite seamless, and so it becomes very much part of it. And this notion of, the sort of traffic between, the dead and the living, as you said with Obon, actually, as you said, it appears everywhere, that sort of thing. But this idea that the dead can come backwards and forwards, and that the living have an obligation to the dead to do these ceremonies because they're expected, and you don't say, "Oh, the dead have gone now. That's it. The door's closed. It's gone." No, they're coming back all the time. So, I mean, one funny little story. So Myokyo had there was a monk who was training at Daitokuji at the same time, a man called Yotoku-san, and he remained at Daitokuji, married, and he did the usual priest thing. But he was head of administration at Daitokuji. He's retired now. But anyway, one of our people here, she was Japanese, and so she used to go to Japan, obviously, see her family quite often. Anyway, she used to look him up and go and have, a meal or something like that in the chat. Anyway, she was there one day. She came back. She said, "Oh God," she said, "a funny thing happened." Said he was officiating at a funeral for one of his parishioners, an elderly lady who had died in her 90s. And after the service, they all went back to the family home, and there was, children and grandchildren, and I think even great-grandchildren. She was in her 90s. And they were all sat down, having a cup of tea and all this. And he said, talking to he said, funny thing, he said, "I actually dreamt of your mother," with two of the sons. He said, "Oh, I dreamt of your mother last night, actually." And of course, they take these things very seriously. They said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I was just sitting in a room, and the door opened, and she walked in, and she was carrying 2 steaming pots of pot noodle with chopsticks in. And she came and sat down next to me, and she gave me one, and we just sat and ate the pot noodle in quiet, you see." And their jaws dropped, and they said, "Oh my God, she loved pot noodle. But because it's full of additives, we wouldn't let her have any because we didn't think they were good for her." So Yotoku said, "Well, she did live to 97. I mean, I'm sure the odd pot noodle's not going to do her any harm." So one of the grandchildren was dispatched to go to the local supermarket, get 2 bags of pot noodles. They brought them back, they put them on the ancestral altar and lit incense and asked for her forgiveness. So that idea that the dead are very close, and that you can ask for their forgiveness and say, "Oh my God, sorry, Granny," about doing that sort of thing is quite normal, and in that society it's something that is a little bit more alien for us. So I think we find it, we're not quite sure what to make. This is why I think people have difficulty with things like karma and rebirth. It just feels a little bit, and that's why secular Buddhists often drop karma and rebirth. They find it slightly awkward. They don't want, because it challenges, the way we've been brought up to regard what is true and what's real and so forth. But Buddhism is it grows in a very different soil, and I think I've said this before, that a lot of people in the West, Western Buddhists included, haven't really understood or taken on board just how radical Buddhism is, really, and how radical to us it is. We sort of politely ignore the difficult bit. Okay, shall we? Yeah. Okay. So I think we probably better say. Will you do the dedication? Thank you.
I think we should remember all the suffering that's going on worldwide, but also close to home. People have died, colleagues I know, and there's a funeral, and it goes on. So may all beings overcome their suffering, or at least be able to face it. May whatever benefit arises from this practice go to the benefit of all sentient beings, stirred by the waves of birth, sickness, aging, and death. May they be free from the oceans of samsara. So Martin, thank you very much. That was very entertaining. Normally, when you teach, whatever you're delivering, you intersperse it with anecdotes, but this was a whole night.
Yes.
And much appreciated. Maybe another time would be nice. We've got a story about
It's the opportunity comes.
or some, yes, or some other sequence of anecdotes. So we normally applaud you at this stage, but maybe hip hip hooray, hip hip hooray.
That's fine. That's fine. Good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you very much. All right. And thank you very much online as well. I think there we go. Thank you, Helen.
Momentarily